Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen had always been too much. Too emotional, too sensitive, too quick to care about the soldiers under her command. At 28, she served as a medical liaison with the 82nd Airborne Division, stationed at Forward Operating Base Blackstone in eastern Afghanistan. Her fellow officers often whispered behind her back about how she got too attached to her patients, how she asked too many questions during briefings, how she cried when they lost soldiers. What they didn't know was that Sarah had completed 3 tours in Iraq as a combat medic, had earned 2 Bronze Stars for valor under fire, and had developed revolutionary trauma protocols that had saved over 200 lives in active combat zones. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel courtyard of FOB Blackstone as Sarah made her way to the medical tent. Her boots crunched against the rocky ground, each step measured and purposeful, despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She had been awake for 36 hours straight, tending to casualties from a roadside bomb that had torn through a convoy the previous evening. 3 soldiers had come back alive because of her quick thinking and steady hands, but all anyone seemed to remember was how she had shouted at the helicopter pilot to wait an extra 2 minutes so she could stabilize the most critical patient. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb had been particularly vocal about her emotional outburst. During the morning briefing, he had made pointed comments about maintaining professional composure and following proper chain of command protocols. The other officers had nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the same skepticism that Sarah had encountered throughout her military career. They saw her tears after losing a patient as weakness rather than dedication. They interpreted her advocacy for better medical supplies as insubordination rather than expertise. Sarah entered the medical tent and began her routine inspection of supplies and equipment. The facility was well stocked compared to some of the remote outposts she had served at, but she could see areas for improvement. The trauma bay layout was inefficient, creating unnecessary delays during critical moments. The blood storage system was outdated, requiring manual temperature monitoring that could lead to dangerous fluctuations. Most importantly, the emergency protocols were designed for conventional warfare rather than the complex insurgency tactics they faced daily. She pulled out a worn notebook and began sketching modifications to the trauma bay configuration. Her design would reduce patient processing time by 40% while improving the flow of medical personnel during mass casualty events. It was based on lessons learned from her previous deployments, where she had witnessed both spectacular saves and heartbreaking losses. Every line in her sketch represented a life that could be saved, a family that would remain whole, a soldier who would come home. The tent flap opened, and Corporal Jake Morrison stepped inside, his face grim with the kind of expression that meant trouble was coming. Morrison was one of the few soldiers who respected Sarah's experience and judgment. He had been with her during a particularly brutal firefight in Mosul, where her quick thinking had saved his squad from an ambush. "Doc, we got a problem," Morrison said, using the nickname that had followed her from Iraq. "Colonel Webb wants to see you in the command tent, now." Sarah set down her notebook and followed Morrison across the compound. The command tent buzzed with activity as intelligence officers analyzed satellite feeds and communications personnel coordinated with other units in the region. Colonel Webb stood at the center of it all, his presence commanding attention from everyone in the vicinity. He was career military, a man who had risen through the ranks during peacetime and approached warfare with textbook precision rather than battlefield intuition. "Sergeant Chen," Webb called out as she approached. "I've been reviewing your medical supply requests, and I have concerns about your recommendations." Sarah had submitted a detailed report outlining critical shortages in their medical inventory. They were running dangerously low on advanced trauma supplies, particularly the specialized equipment needed for treating blast injuries and penetrating wounds. Her requests were based on casualty projections and supply consumption rates from similar operations. "Sir, the projections are based on current casualty rates and anticipated operational tempo," Sarah replied. "We're seeing more complex trauma, cases that require specialized equipment." Webb's expression hardened. "Your emotional investment in individual cases is clouding your judgment, Sergeant. We operate within budget constraints and established protocols. I will not have medical personnel making supply decisions based on feelings rather than facts." The accusation stung because it was both unfair and predictable. Sarah had backed every recommendation with statistical analysis and operational data. Her projections had proven accurate in previous deployments, yet Webb was dismissing her expertise because of his preconceived notions about her emotional nature. "Sir, with respect, my recommendations are based on combat experience and medical best practices," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite her frustration. "The data supports increased trauma supply allocation for forward operating bases in high-contact areas." Webb stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone that carried clear warning. "Sergeant, you seem to have trouble understanding your role here. You treat casualties as they arrive. You do not make strategic decisions about resource allocation. Your job is to follow orders, not question them." Other officers in the tent had stopped their conversations to watch the exchange. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, could sense their judgment. To them, she was proving Webb's point about being too emotional, too invested, too difficult to manage. They didn't see a seasoned combat medic advocating for her patients. They saw a woman who couldn't control her feelings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, knowing that further argument would only reinforce their perceptions. "Is there anything else?" Webb waved her away dismissively. "Stick to medicine, Sergeant. Leave the bigger picture to those who understand it." As Sarah left the command tent, she heard muffled laughter from some of the junior officers. The sound followed her across the compound like a persistent echo. She had encountered this attitude throughout her military career, but it never stopped being painful. Her dedication was seen as emotional instability. Her expertise was dismissed as overreach. Her tears for fallen soldiers were viewed as professional weakness rather than human compassion. Back in the medical tent, Sarah found solace in her work. She updated patient charts, reviewed treatment protocols, and continued planning improvements to their medical operations. This was where she belonged, where her skills and knowledge made a difference. Here, results mattered more than perceptions. Lives were saved through competence and caring, not through conforming to others' expectations. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing intelligence reports that she had requested from the communications center. While officially outside her area of responsibility, she made it a practice to understand the tactical situation affecting her patients. Knowing the nature of operations helped her anticipate medical needs and prepare for specific types of casualties. The reports painted a concerning picture. Intelligence indicated increased insurgent activity in their sector, with particular emphasis on improved explosive devices and coordinated attacks. Enemy forces had been studying American medical evacuation procedures and were developing tactics specifically designed to maximize casualties and disrupt medical operations. This information reinforced Sarah's concerns about their medical preparedness. She opened her laptop and began drafting a comprehensive medical readiness assessment. The document outlined current capabilities, identified critical vulnerabilities, and provided recommendations for improving their ability to handle mass casualty situations. Her analysis included tactical considerations that most medical officers wouldn't think to address, insights gained from years of treating the wounded while bullets flew overhead. The assessment detailed how enemy forces were adapting their tactics to target medical operations. They were using secondary explosions timed to catch medical responders, employing weapons designed to create maximum trauma damage, and coordinating attacks to overwhelm medical facilities. Sarah's recommendations included defensive measures for medical personnel, modified evacuation procedures, and enhanced trauma protocols designed for worst-case scenarios. As she worked, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. She had enlisted straight out of high school, driven by a desire to serve and a natural aptitude for emergency medicine. Her first deployment to Iraq had been a baptism by fire, treating casualties in conditions that would challenge the most experienced trauma surgeons. She had learned to perform complex medical procedures while under enemy fire, to make life or death decisions with incomplete information, and to carry the weight of every soldier she couldn't save. Her second deployment had been to a remote outpost, where she served as the only medical personnel for over 300 soldiers. During a massive insurgent assault, she had treated 47 casualties in a single night, performing surgery by flashlight when the generator failed and organizing casualty evacuation under intense enemy fire. Her actions had earned her first Bronze Star and the respect of every soldier in her unit. The third deployment had been the most challenging yet. Assigned to a Special Operations Task Force, she had participated in high-risk missions where medical planning was often an afterthought. She had developed new techniques for treating blast injuries, created improved protocols for battlefield trauma care, and trained special operations medics in advanced life-saving procedures. Her innovations had been adopted by medical units throughout the theater of operations. Despite these accomplishments, Sarah found herself constantly fighting perceptions about her emotional nature. Male medics who showed similar dedication were praised for their commitment. When Sarah displayed the same level of investment in her patients, she was labeled as too emotional or difficult to manage. The double standard was frustrating but not surprising. She had learned to navigate it by focusing on results rather than recognition. Her reputation among enlisted soldiers was entirely different from her standing with officers. The troops who had served with her in combat knew her capabilities and trusted her judgment completely. They had seen her run into enemy fire to reach. Wounded soldiers had watched her work miracles with limited supplies, and had witnessed her fight bureaucracy to ensure they received proper medical care. To them, she was a legend, a medic who would move heaven and earth to bring them home alive. The disconnect between these two perceptions created a constant tension in Sarah's military career. She was simultaneously one of the most respected and most criticized members of her unit. Soldiers would request assignment to her medical team, while officers viewed her as a management problem. Her personnel file contained both commendations for exceptional performance and counseling statements for insubordination. This pattern had followed her to FOB Blackstone, where Colonel Webb embodied the worst aspects of peacetime military leadership applied to wartime operations. He valued compliance over competence, protocol over performance. His approach to leadership was based on maintaining order rather than achieving results, and Sarah's unconventional methods threatened his sense of control. The situation was further complicated by the unique challenges of their current deployment. FOB Blackstone was positioned in a strategically important, but tactically vulnerable location. They were responsible for providing medical support to multiple smaller outposts while also conducting their own patrol operations. The medical team was understaffed and under-equipped for the scope of their responsibilities, yet requests for additional resources were routinely denied. Sarah had identified several critical vulnerabilities in their current medical operations. Their evacuation routes were predictable and could be easily targeted by enemy forces. Their medical facility lacked adequate protection against indirect fire attacks. Most concerning, their emergency response procedures were not designed for the type of coordinated attacks that intelligence suggested were being planned. She had attempted to address these concerns through official channels, submitting detailed reports and recommendations to Colonel Webb and his staff. Each report had been acknowledged but not acted upon. Her suggestions were dismissed as alarmist or outside her area of expertise. The message was clear. Her job was to treat casualties, not to think strategically about medical operations. This attitude frustrated Sarah because she understood the interconnected nature of military operations better than most officers realized. Medical considerations affected tactical planning, logistics, and personnel deployment. A medic who understood these connections could provide valuable insights that might prevent casualties rather than simply treating them after the fact. As Sarah finished her assessment, she made a decision that she knew would further strain her relationship with Colonel Webb. She would send copies of her report not just to the chain of command at FOB Blackstone, but also to the regional medical command and the special operations units that frequently operated in their area. These organizations might be more receptive to her recommendations and could provide the pressure needed to implement necessary changes. The decision carried significant risk. If Colonel Webb discovered her actions, he could charge her with insubordination. Or worse, her military career could be permanently damaged, and her ability to serve the soldiers who depended on her could be eliminated. But Sarah had learned that sometimes doing the right thing required accepting personal risk. She encrypted the files and began the process of transmitting them through secure channels. As the uploads progressed, she thought about the soldiers, currently sleeping in bunks throughout the compound. They trusted their leadership to make decisions that would keep them safe and bring them home alive. Sarah refused to let bureaucratic inertia compromise that sacred responsibility. The morning would bring new challenges and probably new conflicts with Colonel Webb. But tonight, Sarah had done everything in her power to prepare for the dangers she could see coming. Whether anyone listened to her warnings remained to be seen. But she would not be able to live with herself if she had stayed silent and soldiers died as a result. The harassment began 3 days after Sarah sent her encrypted reports to regional command. It started subtly, as these things often do, with small changes that could be dismissed as coincidence or routine adjustments. Sarah's duty schedule was modified to include additional overnight shifts that left her exhausted during critical daytime operations. Her access to certain medical supplies required additional authorization forms that slowed her ability to respond to emergencies. Most telling, her requests for routine equipment maintenance were suddenly subject to lengthy approval processes. Colonel Webb's strategy was methodical and calculated. During morning briefings, he would ask Sarah to explain medical procedures in excruciating detail, then interrupt her answers to question her reasoning or suggest that simpler approaches would be more appropriate. When other officers presented tactical plans, Webb would turn to Sarah and ask if the medical corps had any emotional concerns about the proposed operations. The phrase became his favorite weapon, delivered with a slight smile that made clear his opinion of her professional judgment. The other officers took their cues from Webb's behavior. Captain Rodriguez, the intelligence officer, began referring to medical assessments as feelings reports during planning sessions. Major Patterson, who commanded the base security forces, would dramatically ask if anyone needed a tissue before discussing casualty projections. The jokes were always delivered with enough humor to provide plausible deniability, but their intent was unmistakable. Sarah endured these attacks on her professionalism with outward composure, but inside she felt the familiar sting of being dismissed and diminished. She had experienced similar treatment throughout her career, but the intensity at FOB Blackstone was particularly cruel because it directly threatened her ability to save lives. When officers questioned her competence publicly, it undermined the confidence that enlisted soldiers had in her medical care. The situation escalated when Sergeant First Class Maria Santos approached Sarah with a concerning revelation. Santos was a respected squad leader, who had served multiple deployments and commanded the loyalty of her soldiers through competence and genuine care for their welfare. She was also one of the few people at FOB Blackstone who treated Sarah with consistent respect and professionalism. "Doc, we need to talk," Santos said, finding Sarah in the medical tent during a brief quiet period. "Some of the newer guys are asking questions about whether they should trust you for serious injuries. They're hearing things from the officers." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her greatest fear was that the political games being played in the command structure would eventually affect her ability to provide medical care. If soldiers began to doubt her competence, they might delay seeking treatment or refuse her care during critical moments. Such hesitation could mean the difference between life and death in combat situations. "What kind of things are they hearing?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Santos looked uncomfortable but continued. "Word is getting around that you're too emotional to handle combat medicine. That you make decisions based on feelings instead of medical facts. Some of the officers have been telling their soldiers that you might freeze up or make mistakes when things get intense." Sarah felt a cold anger building in her chest. The accusations were not just professionally damaging, but personally insulting. She had proven her ability to perform under extreme pressure countless times. Her record included treating casualties while under direct enemy fire, performing surgery in bombed-out buildings, and maintaining composure during mass casualty events that had broken seasoned medics. "Santos, I need you to know something," Sarah said, looking directly into the sergeant's eyes. "I have never lost a patient due to emotional decision-making. My protocols are based on combat experience and medical best practices. If your soldiers need medical care, I will provide the best treatment possible, regardless of what anyone says about my methods." Santos nodded firmly. "I know that, Doc. Most of us who've been around know your reputation. But these new guys don't have that context. They're listening to the officers and getting scared." The conversation revealed the true danger of Webb's campaign against Sarah's credibility. By undermining confidence in her medical abilities, he was creating a situation where soldiers might avoid seeking necessary treatment or fail to follow her instructions during emergencies. The political attack was becoming a direct threat to mission effectiveness and soldier safety. Sarah decided to take a different approach to the problem. Instead of continuing to fight through official channels, she would demonstrate her competence through direct action and education. She began conducting informal medical training sessions for enlisted soldiers, teaching them advanced first aid techniques and explaining how her protocols differed from standard textbook approaches. These sessions revealed the depth of Sarah's knowledge and experience in ways that impressed even skeptical soldiers. She could explain complex trauma procedures in simple terms, demonstrate techniques that they had never seen before, and answer questions about medical situations with the confidence that came from extensive battlefield experience. More importantly, she could tell stories about how her methods had saved lives in situations where conventional approaches would have failed. During one memorable session, Private Johnson asked about treating penetrating abdominal wounds, a common injury from improvised explosive devices. Sarah not only explained the standard protocol, but also described 3 alternative approaches she had developed for situations where traditional treatment was impossible. She detailed how these methods had saved soldiers when evacuation was delayed, when supplies were limited, and when multiple casualties competed for attention. "The textbook tells you to stabilize and evacuate," Sarah explained to the group of soldiers sitting cross-legged on the ground around her. "But what happens when the evacuation helicopter can't land? What do you do when you have 5 critical patients and supplies for 3? That's when experience matters more than following rules." She pulled out her medical kit and began demonstrating improvised techniques, using materials that soldiers could find in any combat situation. Her methods were unorthodox but effective, based on years of treating trauma in austere environments, where creativity often meant the difference between life and death. Word of these training sessions eventually reached Colonel Webb, who was not pleased to discover that Sarah was conducting unauthorized instruction outside the formal training schedule. He called her to his office on a scorching afternoon when the temperature inside the command tent felt like an oven. "Sergeant Chen, I understand you've been conducting medical training without proper authorization," Webb said, not bothering to look up from the paperwork on his desk. "This kind of independent action is exactly what I've been talking about. You can't seem to follow simple protocols." Sarah had anticipated this confrontation and prepared her response carefully. "Sir, I was providing supplemental medical education to enhance unit readiness. The soldiers requested additional training to improve their first aid capabilities." Webb finally looked up, his expression conveying barely controlled irritation. "Did you request permission to conduct this training? Did you coordinate with the medical officer of the day? Did you ensure that your instruction aligned with current medical protocols?" "No, sir, but the training covered standard first aid procedures and combat medical techniques that are part of established curriculum," Sarah replied. "I was responding to a legitimate training need identified by enlisted personnel." "You were freelancing," Webb said sharply. "Again, this is exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that makes you unsuitable for leadership responsibilities. You see soldiers asking questions, and you immediately assume you need to fix the situation yourself instead of working through proper channels." The accusation was fundamentally unfair, because Sarah had repeatedly attempted to work through proper channels only to be ignored or dismissed. Her unauthorized training sessions were a direct result of the command structure's failure to address legitimate concerns about medical readiness and preparation. "Sir, the soldiers need this information to save lives in combat," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice level. "If there are concerns about the content or methods, I'm happy to adjust the training to meet any requirements." Webb leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of someone who had made a decision and was simply looking for justification. "Sergeant Chen, you're going to stop these unauthorized training sessions immediately. Furthermore, you're going to stick to your assigned duties and stop trying to solve problems that are outside your area of responsibility." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, though she knew the order was both wrong and potentially dangerous. "And one more thing," Webb continued. "I'm recommending you for a fitness evaluation to determine whether you're psychologically suited for combat operations. Your emotional instability and failure to follow orders suggest that you might be suffering from stress-related issues that require professional intervention." The threat was designed to be career-ending. A negative psychological evaluation could result in Sarah being removed from combat duty permanently, ending her ability to serve as a medic and destroying her military career. Worse, such an evaluation would become part of her permanent record, affecting any future employment in medical fields. Sarah realized that Webb was escalating beyond simple harassment into active sabotage of her career and reputation. The psychological evaluation would be conducted by military psychiatrists who would rely heavily on Webb's assessment of her performance and behavior. If he painted her as emotionally unstable and insubordinate, the evaluation would likely support his conclusions, regardless of her actual mental health. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing her options and considering her next moves. She could request a transfer to another unit, but that would mean abandoning the soldiers at FOB Blackstone who depended on her medical expertise. She could file formal complaints about Webb's behavior, but his rank and political connections made success unlikely. Most challenging, she could continue fighting the system while trying to maintain her effectiveness as a medic. The decision was complicated by intelligence reports indicating increased enemy activity in their sector. Insurgent forces were definitely planning something significant, and Sarah's analysis suggested that their medical facilities would be targeted as part of any major attack. Webb's refusal to implement her security recommendations meant that they remained vulnerable to tactics specifically designed to maximize medical casualties. Sarah made copies of all her medical protocols and training materials, encrypting them on secure drives that she could hide if necessary. If Webb succeeded in having her removed from duty, she wanted to ensure that her knowledge and innovations could still benefit the soldiers she was leaving behind. The techniques she had developed could save lives even if she wasn't present to implement them personally. She also began documenting every interaction with Webb and his supporters, creating a detailed record of the harassment and discrimination she was experiencing. While such documentation might not prevent her removal, it could provide evidence for future investigations or appeals. More importantly, it might protect other medical personnel who faced similar treatment in the future. The psychological evaluation was scheduled for the following week, giving Sarah limited time to prepare for what could be the final battle for her military career. She would face military psychiatrists who were predisposed to support command recommendations, armed only with her record of service and her conviction that saving lives was more important than following orders that put soldiers at risk. As Sarah prepared for sleep, she thought about the soldiers currently standing guard around the perimeter of FOB Blackstone. They trusted their leadership to make decisions that would keep them safe and bring them home alive. Colonel Webb's campaign against her was not just about one medic's career, but about whether competence or politics would determine how medical care was provided in combat zones. The stakes could not be higher, and Sarah knew that the next few days would determine not just her future, but potentially the lives of every soldier under her care. She had faced enemy fire, bureaucratic incompetence, and professional discrimination throughout her career. Now she would face the ultimate test of her ability to protect the soldiers who depended on her, even when her own leadership was working against her. The morning would bring new challenges and probably the beginning of the end of her military career. But tonight, Sarah had done everything possible to prepare for the fight ahead. Whether she survived it depended on factors largely beyond her control, but she would not go down without ensuring that someone, somewhere would continue the work of keeping soldiers alive. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday, just as Sarah had predicted in her buried intelligence assessment. The first explosion shattered the morning quiet at exactly 05:30, sending shockwaves through the sleeping compound and triggering emergency alarms that screamed across FOB Blackstone. Sarah was already awake, having spent another sleepless night reviewing medical protocols and preparing for the psychological evaluation that could end her career. The sound of incoming mortar was grimly familiar, but the coordinated precision of this assault was unlike anything they had experienced before. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and sprinted toward the medical tent, her boots pounding against the gravel as secondary explosions erupted around the compound perimeter. The enemy had studied their defensive positions and was targeting specific vulnerabilities that she had identified in her security assessment months earlier. They were using a layered attack strategy designed to overwhelm medical operations and maximize casualties among responding personnel. Inside the medical tent, chaos reigned as wounded soldiers began arriving in waves. The first casualties were guards from the perimeter towers who had been caught in the initial mortar barrage. Sarah immediately began triaging patients, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed injuries and prioritized treatment. Despite the intensity of the situation, her mind remained clear and focused, drawing on years of experience treating trauma under fire. Corporal Morrison stumbled through the tent entrance carrying Private Williams, whose left leg had been nearly severed by shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade. Blood soaked through the improvised tourniquet that Morrison had applied during the evacuation, and Williams was rapidly approaching shock from blood loss. This was exactly the type of complex trauma case that required immediate surgical intervention and advanced life support measures. Sarah quickly established intravenous access and began fluid resuscitation, while simultaneously preparing for emergency surgery. The wound required immediate amputation to control bleeding, followed by aggressive treatment to prevent infection and stabilize the patient for evacuation. Under normal circumstances, this procedure would be performed in a fully equipped surgical suite with multiple medical personnel assisting. "Morrison, I need you to assist with this surgery," Sarah commanded, her voice cutting through the noise of ongoing explosions. "Scrub your hands with that antiseptic solution and help me maintain pressure on the arterial bleed." Morrison's face went pale, but he followed her instructions without hesitation. Sarah had trained him in advanced first aid techniques during her unauthorized medical sessions, and that training was now proving crucial for saving his fellow soldier's life. As she worked to control the bleeding and prepare for amputation, more casualties continued arriving at the medical tent. The tactical situation outside was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces had successfully breached the outer perimeter and were advancing toward the main compound using coordinated fire and movement techniques. The attack was clearly designed to force American forces into defensive positions while insurgent teams targeted critical infrastructure, including communications, supply storage, and medical facilities. Colonel Webb's voice crackled over the radio communication system, his commands growing increasingly frantic as reports came in from around the compound. "All medical personnel maintain positions and treat casualties as they arrive. Do not venture outside designated areas without explicit authorization." Sarah recognized the fundamental flaw in Webb's approach immediately. By keeping medical personnel confined to fixed positions, he was allowing the enemy to dictate the terms of casualty treatment and evacuation. Her assessment had specifically warned against this passive approach, recommending instead that medical teams be deployed forward to retrieve wounded soldiers and prevent them from becoming isolated in contested areas. The radio crackled again with urgent calls for medical assistance from multiple locations around the compound. Squad leaders were reporting wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated due to intense enemy fire. These casualties were trapped in positions where they could not receive adequate medical care, and their conditions would continue deteriorating without immediate intervention. Sarah made a decision that she knew would directly violate Webb's orders, but was necessary to save lives. She gathered her mobile medical kit and turned to Morrison, who was still assisting with the surgical procedure on Private Williams. "Morrison, I need you to finish bandaging Williams and prepare him for evacuation," she said, her voice steady despite the explosions continuing outside. "I'm going forward to retrieve the casualties who can't make it back on their own." Morrison looked up from the patient, his face reflecting both concern and understanding. "Doc, the colonel specifically said to stay in the medical tent. You'll be in direct violation of orders." "The colonel's orders are going to get soldiers killed," Sarah replied, checking her medical supplies and ensuring she had everything necessary for field treatment. "Those wounded soldiers out there will die if someone doesn't reach them soon. I'm not going to let that happen because of bureaucratic protocol." She shouldered her medical pack and moved toward the tent entrance, pausing only to grab additional trauma supplies and ammunition for the pistol holstered at her side. Decision to leave the relative safety of the medical tent was both tactically dangerous and professionally suicidal. But Sarah had learned long ago that saving lives sometimes required accepting personal risk. The scene outside the medical tent was like stepping into a war zone from her worst nightmares. Smoke billowed from burning vehicles and damaged buildings, while the constant crack of small arms fire echoed off the concrete walls. Enemy mortar continued falling at irregular intervals, their explosions sending deadly fragments in all directions. Most concerning, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions that had not been there the previous evening. She moved carefully between buildings, using cover and concealment techniques that she had learned during her special operations deployments. Her medical training had included extensive instruction in battlefield movement and tactical awareness, skills that proved invaluable as she navigated through the active combat zone toward the first group of wounded soldiers. The radio on her belt crackled with increasingly desperate calls for medical assistance. Sergeant Santos was trapped with 2 wounded soldiers in a defensive position that was taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Staff Sergeant Wilson had been hit by shrapnel and was losing consciousness due to blood loss. Private Davis had sustained a penetrating chest wound and was experiencing difficulty breathing that suggested a collapsed lung. Each call represented a life hanging in the balance, soldiers who would die without immediate medical intervention. Sarah had the training and experience to save them, but reaching their positions would require moving through areas actively contested by enemy forces. The tactical situation made evacuation by other personnel impossible, leaving medical intervention as the only option for preventing multiple fatalities. Sarah reached the first casualty site, where she found Private Davis conscious but struggling to breathe through a punctured lung caused by a rifle round that had penetrated his body armor. The wound was immediately life-threatening and required emergency decompression to prevent complete respiratory failure. Without proper treatment, Davis would suffocate within minutes as pressure built up in his chest cavity. Working quickly under enemy fire, Sarah inserted a needle thoracostomy to relieve the pressure and restore normal breathing. The procedure required precise placement to avoid damaging major blood vessels, and performing it in a combat environment demanded steady hands and absolute concentration. As she worked, bullets struck the wall above her position, sending concrete fragments raining down on both medic and patient. "Davis, I need you to stay conscious and keep talking to me," Sarah said while securing the chest tube and checking his vital signs. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to focus on breathing normally while I get you ready for movement." The young soldier nodded weakly, his color improving as the chest decompression took effect. Sarah quickly bandaged the entry wound and administered pain medication to make him more comfortable during evacuation. The entire procedure took less than 5 minutes, but those minutes had been crucial for preserving his life and preventing permanent disability. Moving Davis to safety required carrying him across 50 yards of open ground while under direct observation by enemy snipers. Sarah coordinated with nearby friendly forces to provide covering fire while she dragged the wounded soldier to a protected position behind a concrete barrier. The movement was exhausting and dangerous, but it successfully moved Davis to a location where he could receive additional medical care and eventual evacuation. The radio continued broadcasting calls for medical assistance from other positions around the compound. Sarah realized that she was facing a mass casualty situation that exceeded the capabilities of conventional medical response protocols. The enemy had successfully created multiple isolated pockets of wounded soldiers who could not be reached by normal evacuation procedures. Her next destination was Sergeant Santos, who was pinned down with 2 critically wounded soldiers in a defensive position that was completely surrounded by enemy forces. The tactical situation made conventional rescue impossible, but Sarah had developed alternative approaches during her previous deployments that might succeed where standard methods would fail. She coordinated with the base fire support team to provide covering fire and smoke screens that would mask her movement towards Santos' position. The plan required precise timing and carried enormous risk, but it offered the only realistic chance of reaching the wounded soldiers before their injuries became fatal. As Sarah prepared for the most dangerous phase of her rescue mission, Colonel Webb's voice erupted over the radio with barely controlled fury. "All medical personnel return to designated positions immediately. Sergeant Chen, you are ordered to cease unauthorized movement and report to the medical tent." The order came at the worst possible moment, just as Sarah was preparing to move through enemy fire to reach critically wounded soldiers. Obeying Webb's command would mean abandoning Santos and her wounded soldiers to certain death, while defying it would constitute clear insubordination during combat operations. Sarah keyed her radio and responded with calm professionalism that contrasted sharply with Webb's agitated tone. "Colonel, I have multiple critical casualties who will die without immediate medical intervention. I am the only medical personnel in position to reach them. You are violating direct orders and endangering yourself unnecessarily," Webb shot back. "Return to the medical tent immediately or face court-martial for insubordination during combat operations." The threat was clear and potentially career-ending, but Sarah had already made her choice. She turned off her radio to avoid further interference and focused on the tactical situation ahead. Saving lives was more important than preserving her military career, and she would not let bureaucratic concerns prevent her from doing everything possible to bring soldiers home alive. The movement toward Santa's position required crossing 100 yards of terrain that was actively contested by enemy forces. Sarah used smoke grenades and coordinated fire support to mask her approach, moving in short rushes between available cover. Enemy bullets struck the ground around her as she sprinted between positions, but her tactical movement skills and knowledge of the terrain allowed her to avoid being hit. She reached Santa's position just as one of the wounded soldiers was going into shock from massive blood loss. The soldier had sustained multiple penetrating wounds from an improvised explosive device and was rapidly approaching the point where medical intervention would no longer be effective. Sarah immediately began emergency treatment while coordinating with Santos for defensive fire against approaching enemy forces. "Santos, I need you to maintain security while I work on these casualties," Sarah said while establishing intravenous access and beginning fluid resuscitation. "The enemy is trying to overrun this position, and we need to be ready to move as soon as I stabilize these soldiers." Santos nodded grimly, her rifle trained on likely enemy approach routes. She had been holding this position for over an hour, while caring for 2 wounded soldiers, and her ammunition was running dangerously low. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions. Sarah worked with desperate efficiency to stabilize both casualties for movement. The procedures required under these conditions were far more complex than anything taught in military medical schools, drawing on innovations she had developed during years of treating trauma in austere environments. Her hands moved with practiced precision despite the constant sound of gunfire and the knowledge that enemy forces were approaching their position. The larger battle for FOB Blackstone was reaching a critical phase as enemy forces pressed their coordinated assault against weakening defensive positions. Sarah could hear the intensity of combat increasing around the compound as insurgent teams advanced toward their primary objectives. The medical facilities remained a high-priority target, and she knew that her unauthorized rescue mission had left the main medical tent understaffed during a mass casualty event. But looking at the wounded soldiers whose lives depended on her immediate care, Sarah felt no regret about her decision to violate Webb's orders. These soldiers would have died without medical intervention, and no amount of bureaucratic protocol was worth sacrificing their lives. Her oath as a medic was to preserve life and alleviate suffering, responsibilities that transcended military rank structure and administrative convenience. As she finished stabilizing the second casualty, enemy forces launched their final assault on the compound perimeter. The final enemy assault began with a coordinated rocket attack that shattered the main communications tower and severed radio contact between defensive positions. Sarah found herself trapped with Santos and, too critically, wounded soldiers as insurgent forces advanced through the smoke and debris toward their isolated position. The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond anything they had trained for, but Sarah's mind remained focused on the immediate challenge of keeping her patients alive, while enemy fighters closed in from multiple directions. "Santos, we need to move these casualties to the secondary medical bunker," Sarah said while checking the vital signs of both wounded soldiers. The enemy knows our primary medical facility location, but they might not have identified the backup position. Santos looked skeptical about the chances of successfully moving 2 stretcher cases through active combat zones while enemy forces were advancing toward their position. "Doc, we barely have enough ammunition to hold this position for another 10 minutes. How are we going to carry wounded soldiers across 200 yards of open ground?" Sarah had been considering this exact problem since the attack began, and she had developed a plan based on unconventional tactics that she had learned during special operations deployments. The approach required using the enemy's own assault momentum against them while exploiting gaps in their advancing formation. "The insurgents are advancing in waves with specific objectives," Sarah explained while preparing both casualties for movement. "They're focused on overrunning defensive positions and securing key facilities. If we move during their next assault phase, we can use their own covering fire to mask our movement." It was a desperate plan that required precise timing and carried enormous risk, but conventional evacuation methods were impossible under current conditions. The wounded soldiers would die without medical care that could only be provided at the secondary bunker, and waiting for the tactical situation to improve was not a realistic option. Sarah coordinated with Santos to prepare improvised stretchers using equipment available in their defensive position. They would need to carry both casualties simultaneously while moving through terrain that was actively contested by enemy forces. The physical demands would be extreme, but both women had the strength and endurance necessary for the task. As they prepared for movement, Sarah noticed something troubling about the tactical situation developing around FOB Blackstone. The enemy assault was following patterns that suggested detailed knowledge of American defensive procedures and medical protocols. Their timing and target selection indicated intelligence gathering that went far beyond normal insurgent capabilities. "Santos, look at how they're coordinating their attacks," Sarah said while pointing toward enemy movement patterns visible through gaps in the defensive barriers. "They're specifically targeting medical evacuation routes and casualty collection points. Someone gave them detailed information about our procedures." The realization was deeply disturbing because it suggested that enemy forces had access to classified information about medical operations at FOB Blackstone. Such intelligence could have come from intercepted communications, captured documents, or worst of all, from sources within the American command structure itself. The tactical implications were immediate and dangerous. If enemy forces knew medical procedures and evacuation routes, they could position ambushes specifically designed to target medical personnel and wounded soldiers. Sarah's unauthorized rescue mission had succeeded precisely because it deviated from predictable protocols that the enemy had prepared to counter. Radio communications from other parts of the compound painted a grim picture of the overall battle situation. Multiple defensive positions had been overrun, and enemy forces were advancing toward the main command bunker where Colonel Webb was coordinating the defense. The conventional military response was failing against an enemy that had anticipated and prepared for standard American tactics. Sarah made a decision that would define not only her military career, but potentially the outcome of the entire battle for FOB Blackstone. Instead of continuing to follow failed protocols and predictable procedures, she would implement the unconventional medical tactics that she had developed during years of combat experience. "Santos, we're going to do something that's never been attempted in conventional military operations," Sarah said, while shouldering her medical pack and checking her weapon. "We're going to use medical operations as the foundation for a counterattack that exploits enemy weaknesses." The plan was audacious and unprecedented, but it addressed the fundamental problem that was causing the American defense to fail. By abandoning predictable protocols and implementing flexible tactics, they could create opportunities to disrupt enemy operations while simultaneously providing medical care to wounded soldiers throughout the compound. Sarah began coordinating with isolated defensive positions using short-range radio communications that the enemy could not easily intercept. Her message was simple but revolutionary. Instead of waiting for medical evacuation, wounded soldiers who could still fight would receive immediate field treatment that would allow them to rejoin the defense from unexpected positions. The approach required transforming medical operations from a passive support function into an active combat capability. Sarah would move between positions, providing rapid treatment that enabled wounded soldiers to continue fighting while simultaneously gathering intelligence about enemy movements and weaknesses. Her first stop was a machine gun position where Sergeant Wilson had been wounded by shrapnel, but was still conscious and capable of operating his weapon. The injury was painful but not immediately life-threatening, and with proper treatment Wilson could continue providing critical fire support for the defensive effort. Sarah reached Wilson's position by using enemy smokescreens to mask her movement, arriving just as insurgent forces were preparing to assault the machine gun nest. Wilson had been weakened by blood loss and was struggling to maintain effective fire against advancing enemy fighters. "Wilson, I'm going to treat your wound and get you back in the fight," Sarah said while quickly assessing his injuries and beginning emergency treatment. "You're the key to stopping their advance on this sector." The shrapnel wounds required cleaning and suturing to prevent infection, but more importantly, they needed pressure dressings to control bleeding and pain, medication to restore Wilson's combat effectiveness. Sarah worked rapidly while enemy bullets struck the protective barriers around their position. As she treated Wilson's wounds, Sarah observed the enemy assault patterns and identified tactical opportunities that could be exploited by coordinated defensive actions. The insurgent forces were advancing in predictable formations that became vulnerable when they committed to attacking specific positions. "Wilson, when I give you the signal, I want you to shift your fire to the left flank," Sarah instructed, while applying the final dressings to his wounds. "The enemy is concentrating their assault on the right side because they think your position is neutralized." The tactical coordination between medical treatment and combat operations was producing results that exceeded anything achieved by conventional military procedures. Sarah's medical expertise was enabling wounded soldiers to continue fighting, while her battlefield experience was providing tactical insights that improved the overall defensive effort. Her radio crackled with communications from Colonel Webb, who had discovered that Sarah was operating throughout the compound in direct violation of his orders. His voice carried barely controlled fury as he demanded that she return to the medical tent immediately. "Sergeant Chen, you are engaged in unauthorized combat operations and failure to follow direct orders during enemy contact," Webb transmitted over the emergency command frequency. "Return to designated medical facilities immediately, or face immediate court-martial for insubordination and dereliction of duty." Sarah ignored the transmission and continued coordinating with Wilson to disrupt the enemy assault on their sector. Webb's rigid adherence to failed protocols was contributing to the tactical disaster unfolding around FOB Blackstone, and his orders would prevent her from implementing the unconventional solutions necessary to save both lives and the mission. The battle reached its climax when enemy forces launched a final coordinated assault against the main command bunker where Webb and his staff were directing the failing defense. Sarah realized that the conventional military response had completely collapsed, and that unconventional medical tactics offered the only remaining chance for American forces to survive the attack. She coordinated with every wounded soldier capable of fighting to implement a simultaneous counterattack that would exploit enemy overextension and disrupted communications. The plan required wounded soldiers to abandon defensive positions and advance against enemy forces using tactics that no military manual had ever contemplated. "All wounded personnel capable of movement, this is Doc Chun," Sarah transmitted over tactical radio frequencies. "We're going to implement emergency combat medical protocols that require immediate action from everyone who can still fight. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Wounded soldiers throughout the compound began coordinating their actions with Sarah's medical assessments and tactical guidance. They had seen her risk her life repeatedly to provide medical care under impossible conditions, and they trusted her judgment completely. Sarah moved between assault positions, providing rapid medical treatment that enabled wounded soldiers to participate in coordinated attacks against enemy strongpoints. Her medical bag contained supplies for treating combat injuries, but more importantly, it carried tactical intelligence gathered during her unauthorized rescue missions. The counterattack succeeded because it abandoned every predictable protocol that the enemy had prepared to counter. Wounded soldiers advanced from unexpected directions, using tactics that combined medical necessity with combat effectiveness. Enemy forces found themselves facing coordinated assaults from positions they had believed were neutralized. Colonel Webb's voice erupted over command communications as reports reached him about Sarah's unauthorized tactical operations. All units disengage from unauthorized operations immediately. Sergeant Chen is operating without authority and endangering mission success through insubordination. But the wounded soldiers implementing Sarah's medical combat tactics ignored Webb's orders because they could see the results of her approach. Enemy positions were being overrun, American casualties were being reduced, and the tactical situation was finally turning in their favor. The decisive moment came when Sarah coordinated a final assault on the enemy command position that had been directing the coordinated attack against FOB Blackstone. Intelligence gathered during her medical missions had identified the location where insurgent leaders were coordinating their assault, and wounded soldiers had positioned themselves for a surprise attack. The assault succeeded because enemy forces had not anticipated that wounded American soldiers would be capable of coordinated offensive operations. Sarah's medical treatment had restored combat effectiveness to personnel who should have been evacuated, creating tactical opportunities that conventional military doctrine had never considered. As enemy resistance collapsed and insurgent forces began withdrawing from the compound, Sarah found herself facing the consequences of her unauthorized actions. Colonel Webb was demanding her immediate arrest for insubordination, unauthorized combat operations, and failure to follow direct orders during enemy contact. But the tactical results spoke for themselves. American casualties had been minimized through Sarah's unconventional medical tactics, and the defense of FOB Blackstone had succeeded when conventional approaches had failed. Every wounded soldier who had participated in her medical combat operations had survived, and many had returned to full combat effectiveness. The arrival of General Patricia Hayes with a team of investigators fundamentally changed the situation at FOB Blackstone. Hayes had been monitoring radio communications during the battle and had witnessed Sarah's tactical innovations in real time. Her assessment of the situation focused on results rather than protocol compliance. Colonel Webb, I want a complete briefing on the tactical situation and the medical operations that enabled your successful defense, General Hayes announced as she entered the command bunker. Particularly the innovative approaches that restored combat effectiveness to wounded personnel. Webb's face went pale as he realized that his campaign against Sarah had been observed by senior command during actual combat operations. His rigid adherence to failed protocols had nearly resulted in the loss of FOB Blackstone, while Sarah's unauthorized innovations had saved both lives. And the mission. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Webb's discriminatory behavior and its impact on military effectiveness. Sarah's tactical medical innovations were documented and analyzed for implementation throughout military medical operations. More importantly, her case became a catalyst for fundamental changes in how the military recognized and developed unconventional expertise. 6 months after the battle for FOB Blackstone, Sarah received promotion to major and assignment as director. of Tactical Medical Innovation for the Department of Defense. Her protocols for combat medical operations were implemented throughout military medical services, and her approach to integrating medical expertise with tactical planning became standard. Doctrine. The transformation of military medical operations extended far beyond individual career advancement to encompass fundamental changes in how the military recognized and developed exceptional talent. Sarah's story became required reading for military leadership courses, demonstrating how discrimination and rigid thinking could compromise mission effectiveness and endanger lives. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the soldiers, whose lives she had saved through her willingness to challenge failed protocols and implement innovative solutions. They understood that her emotional investment in their welfare had motivated the tactical breakthroughs that conventional military thinking had never achieved. Years later, when military historians analyzed the evolution of combat medical operations in the early 21st century, they identified Sarah Chen as the catalyst for revolutionary changes that transformed how medical expertise was integrated with tactical planning. Her willingness to risk her career for the lives of soldiers under her care had created a legacy that continued saving lives long after her individual service ended. The rescue patch that Sarah now wore represented not just her grandfather's service, but the principle that military excellence required the courage to challenge assumptions and fight for what was right. Her story proved that sometimes the greatest active military service was refusing to follow orders that put soldiers at unnecessary risk. Sarah Chen had been called too emotional, but her emotions had motivated innovations that saved lives and changed military doctrine forever. In the end, her critics had been wrong about everything except the depth of her commitment to bringing every soldier home alive. That commitment had made her not just an exceptional medic, but a revolutionary leader whose influence extended far beyond any single battle or deployment. 2 years after the battle at FOB Blackstone, Major Sarah Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the United States Military Academy at West Point, addressing the newest generation of military leaders who would shape the future of American defense. The invitation to deliver the keynote address for the Academy's Leadership Excellence Conference represented the highest honor of her military career, but more importantly, it provided an opportunity to share lessons that could prevent future soldiers from experiencing the discrimination and systemic failures that had nearly cost lives at FOB Blackstone. The audience included cadets, senior military officers, Department of Defense officials, and international military attaches who had come to learn about the revolutionary changes in combat medical doctrine that had emerged from Sarah's innovations. Her story had become legendary within military circles, but this address would mark the first time she had spoken publicly about the personal costs of challenging institutional bias and the transformative power of refusing to accept deadly mediocrity. Excellence is not about conforming to expectations, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed auditorium. It is about having the courage to challenge systems that fail the people they are meant to protect. Every leader in this room will face moments when following orders conflicts with doing what is right. Your response to those moments will define not only your career, but the lives of those who depend on your leadership. The speech outlined a new paradigm for military leadership that emphasized adaptive thinking over rigid protocol compliance. Sarah detailed how the conventional military approach at FOB Blackstone had created vulnerabilities that enemy forces had successfully exploited, while unconventional medical tactics had provided the flexibility necessary to counter sophisticated insurgent strategies. Her presentation included case studies from multiple combat zones, where her medical innovations had been implemented with extraordinary success. In Iraq, medical teams using Sarah's tactical protocols had reduced battlefield mortality rates by 37% while simultaneously improving the combat effectiveness of wounded personnel. In Afghanistan, special operations units had adopted her integrated medical tactical approaches to conduct missions that would have been impossible under conventional doctrine. But the most powerful examples came from training exercises where military units had practiced both conventional and revolutionary medical approaches under simulated combat conditions. The results consistently demonstrated that Sarah's methods produced superior outcomes in terms of casualty reduction, mission success, and overall unit effectiveness. The emotional investment that my critics once saw as weakness has become the foundation for tactical innovations that save lives every day. Sarah explained to the audience, "Caring deeply about the people you lead is not a liability, but the most important qualification for military leadership. When you truly understand the human cost of your decisions, you develop the motivation necessary to find solutions that others miss." The audience response was immediate and overwhelming. Cadets who had grown up hearing stories about Sarah's tactical innovations were seeing the person behind the legend for the first time. Senior officers who had initially dismissed her approaches were confronting evidence that their traditional methods had been fundamentally flawed. International observers were taking detailed notes about techniques they could implement in their own military organizations. During the question and answer session that followed her presentation, a young female cadet raised her hand with a question that went to the heart of Sarah's experience. "Major Chen, how do you maintain confidence in your abilities when authority figures are telling you that your approach is wrong?" Sarah paused thoughtfully before responding, recognizing the deeper implications of the question. "The most important lesson I learned is that competence speaks louder than criticism. When people question your abilities based on assumptions rather than evidence, your job is to demonstrate excellence so consistently that their assumptions become irrelevant. But you also have to be prepared for the personal cost of challenging systems that resist change." She continued with advice that reflected years of hard-won experience navigating institutional bias while maintaining professional effectiveness. "Document everything. Build relationships with people who judge you based on results rather than preconceptions. Most importantly, never compromise your standards to make others comfortable with your presence. Excellence is not negotiable, and neither is your responsibility to the people who depend on your expertise." The cadet's follow-up question revealed the ongoing challenges faced by women and minorities in military service. What advice would you give to someone who feels like they have to choose between fitting in and speaking up about problems they see? Sarah's response drew on personal experience, but also reflected broader principles that applied to anyone facing similar challenges. Fitting in with a system that produces poor results is not worth the cost of staying silent about preventable failures. Your job is not to make others comfortable, but to ensure that the mission succeeds and that people under your care come home alive. When you have expertise that could save lives, staying silent becomes a form of negligence. The address concluded with Sarah announcing a new initiative that would fundamentally transform how the military identified and developed innovative talent. The Department of Defense was establishing the Chen Center for Tactical Innovation, a research and training facility dedicated to identifying unconventional solutions to complex military challenges. The center would focus specifically on recognizing and developing expertise that might be overlooked by traditional promotion and selection processes. It would provide resources for military personnel to test innovative approaches without fear of career retaliation, and it would create pathways for unconventional thinkers to influence doctrine development and strategic planning. Every military service has people like the person I was at FOB Blackstone, Sarah explained to the audience. Talented individuals whose expertise is being wasted because their approach doesn't match conventional expectations. The Chen Center will find those people and give them the resources necessary to develop solutions that could save thousands of lives. The announcement represented the culmination of Sarah's efforts to transform military culture from within. Rather than simply succeeding despite institutional bias, She had leveraged her success to create systematic changes that would benefit future generations of military personnel. Following her West Point address, Sarah traveled to military installations around the world to implement training programs based on her tactical medical innovations. Each location presented unique challenges that required adapting her approaches to different cultural contexts and operational environments. At Camp Pendleton in California, she worked with Marine Corps units to develop amphibious medical protocols that integrated tactical medicine with beach assault operations. The Marines initially resisted techniques that deviated from their traditional approaches, but Sarah's methods proved superior during realistic training exercises that simulated complex combat scenarios. The breakthrough came during a simulated assault on a fortified beach position where conventional medical protocols had resulted in unacceptable casualty rates during previous exercises. Sarah's integrated approach enabled wounded Marines to continue fighting from defensive positions while receiving medical care that prevented their injuries from becoming fatal. The key insight is that medical care and tactical operations are not separate functions, but integrated aspects of the same mission. Sarah explained to Marine commanders who had initially questioned her methods, "When you treat them as connected, rather than sequential, you create tactical opportunities that conventional approaches cannot achieve." In Germany, Sarah worked with NATO forces to develop standardized protocols that could be implemented across multiple national military organizations. The challenge was creating techniques that could be adapted to different equipment, training standards, and operational procedures, while maintaining the tactical advantages that made her approaches effective. The international collaboration revealed how cultural differences affected military medical practices in ways that Sarah had not previously considered. European military organizations had different relationships between officers and enlisted personnel, alternative approaches to risk management, and distinct perspectives on the integration of medical and tactical operations. Working with British Special Forces, Sarah discovered that their more flexible command structure actually facilitated implementation of her tactical medical innovations. The British emphasis on individual initiative and adaptive thinking created an environment where unconventional approaches were more readily accepted and implemented. French military medical services provided insights into how her techniques could be scaled for large-scale operations involving multiple divisions and complex logistics chains. The French approach to centralized planning and coordinated execution offered lessons about implementing systematic changes across entire military organizations. German military engineering capabilities enabled Sarah to develop new medical equipment specifically designed for her tactical protocols. German precision manufacturing and innovative design produced medical kits that were lighter, more versatile, and better adapted for use in active combat environments than anything previously available. The international perspective also revealed how Sarah's story had influenced military cultures beyond the United States. Young officers from multiple countries had studied her example and were implementing similar approaches within their own military organizations. Her willingness to challenge institutional bias had inspired a global movement toward more inclusive and effective military leadership. During a joint training exercise in Poland, Sarah observed a young Norwegian medical officer implementing techniques that clearly drew inspiration from her tactical innovations. The officer was integrating medical care with combat operations in ways that exceeded even Sarah's original approaches, demonstrating how innovative ideas could evolve and improve when implemented by creative minds. "This is what success looks like," Sarah reflected while watching the exercise. "Not just individual achievement, but systemic change that enables others to build on your work and develop even better solutions." The observation highlighted how Sarah's influence extended far beyond her personal career to encompass fundamental changes in how military organizations approached complex challenges. Her example had demonstrated that questioning conventional wisdom and developing innovative solutions was not just acceptable, but essential for military effectiveness. Back in the United States, the Chen Center for Tactical Innovation was producing results that exceeded even Sarah's ambitious expectations. The facility had identified dozens of military personnel whose unconventional expertise had been overlooked by traditional promotion systems, and their innovations were beginning to influence doctrine development across all branches of military service. Captain Maria Santos, the daughter of Sarah's former colleague, had developed new approaches to urban warfare that integrated psychological operations with medical care to reduce civilian casualties while maintaining tactical effectiveness. Her techniques were being tested in multiple conflict zones with promising preliminary results. Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, a logistics specialist who had been passed over for promotion multiple times, had created supply chain innovations that could reduce medical equipment weight by 40% while improving reliability and versatility. His designs were being manufactured for distribution throughout military medical services. Major Jennifer Walsh, a communications officer whose suggestions had been repeatedly dismissed by her superiors, had developed encrypted medical coordination systems that enabled real-time tactical medical planning across multiple units and command levels. Her technology was being implemented by special operations forces around the world. Each success story represented not just individual achievement, but validation of Sarah's conviction that military excellence required recognizing and developing talent wherever it existed. The Chen Center was proving that systematic approaches to identifying unconventional expertise could produce innovations that traditional methods would never discover. The personal costs of Sarah's journey had been significant, but the results justified every sacrifice she had made. Her willingness to risk her career for her principles had created opportunities for thousands of other military personnel to contribute their expertise without facing the discrimination and institutional resistance that she had overcome. During a quiet moment in her office at the Chen Center, Sarah received a letter from Private Williams, the soldier whose life she had saved during her first unauthorized rescue mission at FOB Blackstone. Williams had completed his recovery and was now serving as a medical instructor at Fort Sam Houston, where he was teaching Sarah's tactical protocols to the next generation of combat medics. Major Chen, I wanted you to know that everything I teach my students begins with the lesson you taught me, Williams wrote. Excellence requires courage, and courage means doing what is right, even when others tell you it is wrong. Thank you for showing us that caring about people is not weakness, but the foundation of true strength. The letter represented thousands of similar messages that Sarah had received from soldiers whose lives had been touched by her innovations and example. Each message reinforced her conviction that the emotional investment her critics had once scorned was actually the most important qualification for military leadership. Sarah's story had become more than an individual success, but a blueprint for systemic change that could transform any organization willing to challenge its assumptions and embrace innovative thinking. Her legacy would continue influencing military culture long after her individual service ended, proving that one person's courage to stand up for their principles could create changes that benefited countless others. The young woman who had once been dismissed as too emotional had become a transformative leader whose influence extended around the world. Her critics had been wrong about everything except her deep commitment to the people she served, and that commitment had proven to be the source of innovations that conventional military thinking could never have achieved. Sarah Chen's journey from outcast to innovator demonstrated that true leadership meant having the courage to challenge systems that failed the people they were meant to protect, regardless of the personal cost of standing up for what was right. 5 years after establishing the Chen Center for Tactical Innovation, Colonel Sarah Chen received an unexpected assignment that would test her leadership principles on a scale she had never imagined. The Secretary of Defense personally requested Her leadership of a joint international task force, investigating systematic failures in military medical responses during recent humanitarian crises. The assignment came with unprecedented authority to implement changes across multiple nations and military organizations, but also with the knowledge that powerful institutional forces would resist any reforms that challenged established hierarchies. The investigation had been triggered by a devastating earthquake in Southeast Asia, where international military medical responses had failed catastrophically despite massive resource deployment. Traditional military medical protocols had proven inadequate for the complex challenges of coordinated humanitarian operations, resulting in preventable deaths and wasted resources that could have saved thousands of lives. Sarah's initial briefings revealed the scope of the systematic failures that had occurred during the humanitarian response. Multiple nations had deployed medical teams using incompatible protocols, competing command structures, and overlapping areas of responsibility that created chaos rather than coordinated relief efforts. The traditional military approach of rigid hierarchy and predetermined procedures had collapsed when faced with dynamic humanitarian challenges that required adaptive responses. The same institutional thinking that nearly failed at FOB Blackstone has been scaled up to international operations with predictably disastrous results. Sarah observed while reviewing after-action reports from the humanitarian mission. We have military organizations from 12 different countries, all implementing their own version of failed protocols while refusing to adapt to changing conditions on the ground. Her task force included military medical personnel from allied nations, humanitarian organization representatives, and civilian disaster response experts, who brought diverse perspectives to the challenge of developing improved coordination protocols. The group faced the enormous challenge of creating unified approaches that could be implemented across radically different military cultures and organizational structures. The first breakthrough came during field exercises in Jordan, where Sarah's team tested integrated humanitarian medical protocols under realistic disaster conditions. Traditional approaches had participants from different nations, working in isolation with minimal coordination and frequent conflicts over resource allocation and operational priorities. Sarah's integrated approach created shared command structures that emphasized expertise over rank and collaborative decision-making over rigid hierarchy. The results were immediately apparent to observers from multiple military organizations. Casualty treatment times were reduced by 60%, resource utilization improved dramatically, and overall mission effectiveness increased substantially. When medical teams operated under collaborative protocols rather than competing national command structures. Lieutenant General Patricia Rodriguez, representing NATO Medical Command, initially resisted Sarah's approaches because they required fundamental changes to established alliance procedures. Colonel Chen, these protocols require our forces to operate under non-national command structures and to share sensitive operational information with civilian organizations. The security implications are significant. Sarah had anticipated this resistance and prepared responses based on operational effectiveness rather than theoretical concerns. General Rodriguez, the security of our medical operations depends on their success, not on maintaining artificial barriers that prevent effective coordination. The earthquake response failed because we prioritized bureaucratic control over operational results. The debate that followed revealed fundamental philosophical differences about military organization and effectiveness that extended far beyond medical operations. Traditional military leaders viewed hierarchical control and information compartmentalization as essential for operational security, while Sarah argued that modern humanitarian challenges required collaborative approaches that prioritized results over procedural compliance. The turning point came when Sarah proposed a live exercise involving actual disaster response scenarios where traditional and innovative approaches could be compared directly. Military medical teams would respond to simulated humanitarian crises, using both conventional protocols and Sarah's collaborative methods, with independent observers evaluating effectiveness and operational outcomes. The exercise took place in Morocco using earthquake simulation technology that created realistic disaster conditions, including damaged infrastructure, displaced populations, and resource shortages that challenged military medical capabilities. Teams from 8 nations participated, using both traditional command structures and Sarah's collaborative protocols in separate response scenarios. The traditional approach produced familiar results with competing national contingents working in isolation, duplicated efforts, and coordination failures that delayed medical care for simulated casualties. Command disputes over operational priorities created bottlenecks that prevented effective resource utilization, while rigid protocols failed to adapt to changing conditions throughout the exercise. Sarah's collaborative approach transformed the same scenario into a coordinated response where expertise determined leadership roles and adaptive decision-making enabled rapid adjustments to evolving conditions. Medical teams from different nations operated as integrated units under shared command structures that emphasized competence over rank and results over procedure. International observers documented dramatic improvements in every measurable aspect of humanitarian medical response when collaborative protocols were implemented. Treatment times decreased, resource efficiency improved, and overall mission effectiveness increased substantially compared to traditional approaches. More importantly, the exercise revealed how Sarah's leadership principles could be scaled from individual medical operations to complex international coordination challenges. Her emphasis on recognizing expertise regardless of its source, adapting to changing conditions, and prioritizing results over protocol compliance produced superior outcomes at every level of military organization. General Rodriguez approached Sarah following the exercise with a transformed perspective on collaborative military operations. Colonel Chen, I need to understand how these protocols can be implemented within existing NATO command structures. The results speak for themselves, but the organizational changes required are enormous. Sarah's response reflected years of experience implementing systematic changes within resistant institutional environments. General, the key insight is that collaborative protocols enhance rather than replace traditional command structures. We're not eliminating hierarchy but creating flexible systems that can adapt hierarchy to operational requirements rather than forcing operations to conform to rigid organizational charts. The conversation led to Sarah's selection as Director of International Military Medical Coordination, a newly created position that would oversee implementation of collaborative protocols across allied military organizations. The assignment represented the ultimate validation of her leadership approach, but also the greatest challenge of her career. Implementing systematic changes across multiple national military organizations required navigating political sensitivities, cultural differences, and institutional resistance on an unprecedented scale. Each country brought distinct military traditions, operational procedures, and organizational cultures that had evolved over centuries of independent development. Sarah's approach emphasized demonstrating results rather than mandating changes, allowing military organizations to adapt collaborative protocols to their existing structures rather than requiring wholesale replacement of established procedures. The strategy recognized that sustainable change required buy-in from military leaders who could see benefits rather than just costs. Her first major test came during a joint training exercise in Eastern Europe where military medical units from 15 nations practiced coordinated responses to simulated chemical weapon attacks. The scenario required rapid deployment of specialized medical capabilities across multiple affected areas while maintaining operational security and preventing contamination spread. Traditional protocols called for each national contingent to operate independently within assigned sectors, coordinating through formal diplomatic channels that could take hours to resolve simple operational questions. The approach had failed repeatedly during previous exercises, resulting in delayed medical responses and unnecessary casualties. Sarah's collaborative approach created integrated medical teams that combined expertise from multiple nations under unified command structures determined by technical competence rather than national representation. Specialists in chemical decontamination, trauma surgery, and mass casualty management worked together regardless of uniform or nationality. The exercise results exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections. Integrated teams reduced response times by 75% while improving treatment effectiveness and resource utilization across all measured parameters. More significantly, the collaborative approach generated innovative solutions that no single national contingent could have developed independently. A breakthrough example occurred when Norwegian decontamination specialists combined their expertise with Korean trauma surgery techniques and American logistics capabilities to develop new protocols for treating chemical weapon casualties in contaminated environments. The innovation emerged from collaborative problem-solving that would have been impossible under traditional command structures. Similar innovations emerged throughout the exercise as specialists from different nations shared expertise and developed integrated solutions to complex humanitarian challenges. Sarah observed that collaborative protocols were not just more efficient, but actually more creative than traditional approaches because they enabled cross-cultural knowledge sharing that generated new ideas. The success of the Eastern Europe exercise led to Sarah's promotion to Brigadier General and assignment as Commanding General of the International Military Medical Cooperation Command, a multinational organization headquartered in Brussels with responsibility for coordinating allied medical capabilities worldwide. The position represented the pinnacle of Sarah's military career, but also brought responsibilities that extended far beyond her previous experience. She was now responsible for military medical operations that could affect millions of people during international crises, with decisions that carried diplomatic as well as operational consequences. Her first major operation came during a pandemic outbreak in Central Africa, where multiple allied nations had deployed medical teams to assist with containment and treatment efforts. Traditional command structures had created the familiar pattern of competing national contingents working in isolation, while duplicating efforts and missing opportunities for effective coordination. Sarah implemented collaborative protocols that created integrated medical teams, operating under unified command structures focused on epidemiological expertise rather than national representation. The approach combined disease surveillance capabilities from different nations with treatment protocols that leveraged each country's specific medical strengths. The operation succeeded beyond all expectations, containing the pandemic outbreak within 6 weeks and establishing treatment protocols that became the international standard for similar crises. More importantly, the collaborative approach generated medical innovations that emerged from cross-cultural knowledge sharing and integrated problem-solving. A landmark breakthrough occurred when British epidemiologists combined their disease modeling expertise with Swiss pharmaceutical capabilities and Canadian logistics systems to develop mobile treatment facilities that could be deployed rapidly to remote outbreak locations. The innovation represented exactly the type of creative solution that Sarah's collaborative approach was designed to enable. The pandemic response operation established Sarah's reputation as a transformative leader whose influence extended far beyond military medical operations to encompass fundamental changes in international cooperation and crisis response. Her approaches were being studied and implemented by civilian disaster response organizations, international development agencies, and humanitarian relief groups worldwide. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from a letter she received from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a civilian epidemiologist who had worked with Sarah's teams during the pandemic response. General Chen, your collaborative approach taught me that expertise has no nationality and that the best solutions emerge when we focus on results rather than organizational politics. Thank you for showing us that military efficiency and humanitarian compassion are not contradictory but complementary values. The letter reflected thousands of similar messages from military personnel, civilian experts, and humanitarian workers whose careers had been influenced by Sarah's example. Her leadership principles were spreading beyond military organizations to transform how international cooperation was conducted across multiple fields and disciplines. Sarah's influence was particularly evident among young military officers who had trained under her collaborative protocols and were now implementing similar approaches within their own organizations. These officers understood that effective leadership required recognizing expertise wherever it existed and creating systems that enabled talented people to contribute regardless of their background or organizational position. Major Lisa Chang, who had served under Sarah during the pandemic response, was now leading medical innovation efforts within the Singapore Armed Forces, using collaborative approaches that emphasized cross-cultural knowledge sharing and adaptive problem-solving. Her success was inspiring similar changes throughout Southeast Asian military organizations. Captain James Mitchell, whose grandfather had been the colonel who discriminated against Sarah at FOB Blackstone, had specifically requested assignment to Sarah's command because he wanted to learn leadership principles that prioritized results over politics. His transformation represented exactly the type of generational change that Sarah's example was creating throughout military culture. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, the daughter of Sarah's former colleague, had been promoted to lead NATO medical coordination efforts using collaborative protocols that Sarah had developed. Her success demonstrated how Sarah's innovations were being institutionalized within major international military organizations. Each success story represented validation of Sarah's conviction that military excellence required recognizing and developing talent wherever it existed. Her willingness to challenge institutional bias and develop innovative solutions had created a legacy that was transforming military culture on a global scale. During a quiet moment in her Brussels office, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from an outcast medical sergeant to a general, whose innovations were influencing military organizations worldwide. The emotional investment that her critics had once scorned as weakness had proven to be the foundation for leadership approaches that were saving lives and transforming institutions across multiple nations. The young woman who had been dismissed as too emotional had become a leader whose influence extended around the world, proving that caring deeply about people was not a liability, but the most important qualification for transformative leadership. Her story demonstrated that sometimes the greatest act of service was refusing to accept systems that failed the people they were meant to protect, regardless of the personal cost of standing up for what was right. Sarah Chen's legacy would continue influencing military culture and international cooperation long after her individual service ended, inspiring future generations of leaders to challenge assumptions, embrace innovation, and prioritize results over politics in their efforts to build a better world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.